Welcome everyone to Safer Packaging, Healthier Families. This is a webinar on toxic food packaging and how to avoid exposure to protect yourself and your family. Thank you so much for joining and your interest in this issue. My name is Jen Engstrom. I'm the State Director for CalPERC. We are a consumer advocacy organization working towards solutions to protect our health, our safety, and our well-being in California. And I'm pleased to be joined today by our presenters, Dr. Rainbow Rubin, the Director of Science with Breast Cancer Prevention Partners, and Kevin Loria, who's the Senior Health and Food Reporter with Consumer Reports. So thank you both for being here. Today, we are going to talk about hidden toxic chemicals in food packaging. So like me, I'm sure many of you are annoyed at the increase in plastic surrounding all of the food at the grocery store. So all those plastic wrappers and containers and bags, they're not only excessive and create waste in our landfills and our environment, but can also be dangerous for our health. Plastic food packaging is made with thousands of chemicals, many of which are incredibly harmful to our health. So today we're going to take a deeper dive. We're going to learn more about what those chemicals are, why they are harmful, what the state can do to improve our packaging, and then what you can do at home to protect your family. We're going to hear from our experts, and then we'll open it up to questions using the Q&A feature. I would recommend taking note of any questions that you have, and we'll get to those at the end. So the first thing that I'm going to do is hand it over to Dr. Rainbow Rubin, Director again of Science with Breast Cancer Prevention Partners. She received her master's in environmental health from UC Berkeley and a PhD in nutritional biology from UC Davis, where she also conducted postdoctoral research in epidemiology and exposure science. She also received the fellowship in reproductive and environmental health at UC San Francisco, where she worked with the US EPA to expand their definition of at-risk populations to include pregnant women. And Dr. Rubin's research focuses on health impacts associated with pre and perinatal toxic exposure and the prevention of chronic disease during vulnerable life stages. So thank you so much for being here, and I'll hand it over to you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right. Hello and welcome. My name is Rainbow Rubin. My background is in environmental health, toxicology, and epidemiology. And I got into this field by studying chronic disease prevention, which led me to environmental health and studying the chemicals in our air, food, and water that impact our health. So today I'll talk about some chemical concerns with food packaging because every single day, most of us unknowingly consume trace amounts of industrial chemicals that were never meant to be eaten. They come not from the food itself, but from the containers, wrappers, cans, and coatings that held it. So we'll talk about three of the most studied and most concerning chemical groups found in food packaging: PFAS, bisphenols, and phthalates. And we'll look at what science tells us about how they get into our bodies, what they do once they're there, and crucially, what we can do about it. Slide, please. So we'll start by defining the three chemical families, what they are chemically and why they exist. Then we'll explain why the packaging industry relies on them so heavily. And from there, we'll cover the science of how these chemicals actually migrate out of packaging and into food. So we'll cover health impacts first for adults, then with specific focus on children who face disproportionately high risks. And we'll close with some alternatives. So glass, stainless steel, and certain safer plastics offer real and practical solutions that are widely available. And three key facts to hold in mind as we go: there are over 1,000 PFAS chemicals currently in use, and BPA, a bisphenol, has been detected in the body of over 90% of Americans tested by the CDC. And children are particularly vulnerable because their organ systems are still developing. So we'll come back to each of these points. Slide, please. So let's define our three chemical families: PFAS, which stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. PFAS is a family of thousands of synthetic chemicals, though over 1,000 are in active commercial use. And what makes them unique is the carbon-fluorine bond at their core. And this is one of the strongest chemical bonds in nature, which is exactly why they're called forever chemicals. So they don't break down in the environment, they don't break down in the human body. Instead, they accumulate over time. And then there are bisphenols, also known as BPA, and its substitutes like BPS and BPF. For example, most people have heard of BPA. It's an industrial chemical developed in the 50s to make hard clear plastic and to coat the inside of metal food cans with epoxy resin. And when concerns about BPA mounted, manufacturers replaced it with other bisphenols like BPS and BPF. But research shows these regrettable substitutes act on the body in very similar ways. And so the entire bisphenol family are potent endocrine disruptors. And the third one is phthalates, the plasticizers. So phthalates are a large class of chemicals added to plastic to soften them. So primarily PVC to make them soft and flexible. Unlike PFAS or bisphenols, phthalates are not chemically bonded to the plastic. They're physically blended in, which means they easily leach out of the plastic, especially when exposed to heat or in contact with fat or acid. And so as a side note, these chemicals are also used to carry synthetic fragrances. So a very easy way to avoid phthalate exposure is to avoid soft plastics like PVC and fragranced household and personal care products. Slide, please. So why are these chemicals so widespread in the first place? PFAS are used because they create an almost miraculous barrier. They repel water and oil simultaneously, and nothing else does this as cheaply or effectively. So that's why you find PFAS coatings on microwave popcorn bags and fast food wrappers, pizza boxes, nonstick cookware. And in 2023, the org I work for, Breast Cancer Prevention Partners, our bill banning PFAS in food packaging went into effect. And so that's one of their actions that inspired me to join this organization. So bisphenols are used primarily to line the inside of metal cans. That thin epoxy coating is what prevents the tomato sauce from tasting metallic and prevents the cans from eroding. It's a genuine functional benefit, but the trade-off is that the coating contains bisphenol compounds that leach into the food inside, especially over time with heat. And then phthalates are used to make flexible plastic. Without plasticizers, PVC is hard and brittle, and add phthalates and you get a soft, durable material that can be used for food wrapping, tubing, and processed plants and flexible packaging. So the core problem is that these chemicals were adopted because they're cheap and effective. Their chemical stability, the very property that makes them useful, is also what makes them dangerous. They were engineered not to degrade. That same persistence means that they accumulate in packaging, in food, and in our bodies. Slide, please. So the pathway from packaging to your body has 4 steps, and you can see them illustrated here. The packaging material contains these chemical additives, and when certain conditions are present, like heat, acidity, fat, or extended contact over time, the chemicals are released from the packaging matrix and transferred to the food or liquid it contains. So heat is the most powerful driver. Studies consistently show that microwaving food in plastic containers dramatically increases chemical migration, even containers labeled microwave safe. That label refers to the container, not the melting, not to the chemical safety. Acidity and fat content also matter. So fatty foods and acidic foods, tomatoes, citrus, vinegar are known to dissolve packaging chemicals much more readily than water. This is why canned tomato products have among the highest bisphenol contamination levels in food testing studies. And plastic is fat soluble, so plastics dissolve into foods with high fat content, like milk or butter or peanut butter, for example. And then time also matters. The longer food sits in contact with packaging, the more chemicals accumulate. And physical degradation, like scratches, dishwashing, UV exposure, accelerates this leaching in reusable plastics. Slide, please. So these chemicals have a range of known adverse health outcomes. PFAS accumulates in the body, particularly in the blood, liver, kidney, and thyroid. Research links PFAS exposure to thyroid hormone disruption, elevated cholesterol, immune system suppression, and cancers of both the kidney and the testes. A landmark study found that PFAS exposure reduces the effectiveness of childhood vaccines. So children with higher PFAS levels had significantly lower antibody response to standard immunizations. Bisphenols are structurally similar to estrogen. They bind to estrogen receptors, disrupting the endocrine system at remarkably low doses. Research links bisphenol exposure to increased risk of breast and prostate cancer, metabolic syndrome and obesity, polycystic ovarian syndrome, and reduced fertility in both sexes. A Harvard study found that BPA in the urine of, like I mentioned before, 93% of Americans tested, demonstrating near universal exposure. Now, the good news with bisphenols is that once we stop taking it in, we excrete it pretty efficiently. But the fact that 93% tested positive means that we're constantly being exposed. So studies have also shown, though, that once we reduce exposure, our levels go down. Phthalates are anti-androgens, so they interfere with testosterone synthesis and signaling. The reproductive harm is extensively documented: reduced sperm quality, genital malformations, and early puberty in girls. So beyond reproductive effects, phthalate exposure is associated with asthma and allergic disease, and at high levels with liver and kidney toxicity. Slide, please. So this is a slide about why children are more vulnerable, and this is where the science is most urgent. So children are not simply small adults. Pound for pound, they eat and drink significantly more than adults relative to their body weight, which means proportionally higher chemical exposure. Their metabolic systems process and excrete these chemicals more slowly, and their organs are actively developing, which creates critical windows of vulnerability that simply don't exist for adults in the same way. Phthalate and bisphenol exposure during pregnancy and early childhood has been linked to measurable differences in brain development. Multiple studies that followed children from birth have found associations between prenatal phthalate exposure and lower IQ scores, increased ADHD symptoms, and behavioral problems. In boys, prenatal phthalate exposure has been linked to a shorter anogenital distance, so that's a marker of feminization of the reproductive system, as well as undescended testes and reduced testosterone. In girls, early puberty onset has been linked to bisphenol exposure, and we know that the age of puberty has been steadily decreasing over many decades. So these are structural and developmental effects, not just statistical associations. And research by a Harvard researcher found that children with higher PFAS blood levels at age 5 had significantly reduced antibody responses to diphtheria and tetanus vaccines. And so it means that some vaccinated children may be less protected than they should be. And so these exposures begin before birth and continue throughout childhood. PFAS, phthalates, and bisphenols have all been detected in the umbilical cord and in breast milk, meaning that exposure begins in utero and continues through breastfeeding during the most sensitive periods of development. There is currently no established safe level of exposure to these chemicals for developing children. Slide, please. And slide again. So that's the problem. Let's talk about some of the solutions because they're accessible and they can have big impacts. So 3 categories of packaging materials are considered safer by the scientific and regulatory community: glass, stainless steel, and certain plastics. Glass is inert. It doesn't react with food, doesn't absorb flavors and odors, and requires no chemical additives in its manufacturing. It withstands high temperature without releasing anything into food, and it can be recycled infinitely without degrading in quality. The FDA classifies glass as generally recognized as safe for all food contact applications, and unlike plastics, that designation has never been challenged. And so for stainless steel, food grade stainless steel specifically grades 304 and 316, is non-reactive and does not require any chemical coatings or liners. So this is significant. It means that no epoxy bisphenol lining is needed, unlike aluminum cans. Stainless steel is widely used in commercial food processing precisely because of its chemical inertness and durability. Okay, so and then there are the plastics. So certain plastics like PET and polyethylene and polypropylene, these are plastic codes 1, 2, 4, and 5. These are fundamentally different from plastics like PVC. They're naturally flexible at the molecular level, and they do not require plasticizers to achieve flexibility. So that means that no phthalates are needed in their manufacture. They also contain no bisphenol-based additives. This doesn't mean that they are not without their issues. Plastics manufacturing is one of the most damaging industries, both in terms of health and environmental harm, so we definitely want to aim to reduce our dependency on plastic as much as possible. But some plastics are better than others. Additionally, a very small percentage of plastics are actually recycled, so less than 10% worldwide. And the chasing arrow symbols on plastic was actually invented by the plastics industry in response to uproars by the public to give the impression to the public that plastics can be and are readily recycled, when that's not actually the case. So, side note. Slide, please. Okay, so let's get a little bit into the chemistry just to make sure that it's crystal clear. So the polyethylene and the polypropylene are both called polyolefins. So these are long chains of carbon and hydrogen atoms, and their molecular structure gives them an inherent flexibility and toughness that doesn't require these additional chemicals to achieve. So this is fundamentally different from PVC, which is known as one of the most harmful and toxic plastics. And it's rigid at its base form and requires that phthalate plasticizer to become flexible. And it's different from polycarbonate, which requires bisphenol A as a building block of the polymer itself. So the comparison table shows the contrast, which ones, how the first 5 listed there contain no phthalates and bisphenols by design, whereas PVC routinely does. Polystyrene, styrofoam may contain styrene monomer residues and endocrine disrupting potential, and polycarbonate and mixed plastics, number 7, also carry the risk of bisphenols. So when buying any plastic food container, look for codes 1, 2, 4, and 5. So those are the best options within plastics. Slide, please. Okay, so here are a few concrete science-backed steps that can meaningfully reduce exposure, and I think we're going to go a little bit more into them, so this is just your intro. So number 1, never microwave in plastic. So even containers labeled microwave safe can leach chemicals when heated. Studies show migration rates increase by orders of magnitude with heat. So transfer food to glass or ceramic before heating. It takes 10 seconds and it matters. Number 2, choose glass for acidic and fatty foods. So tomato sauce, citrus juice, salad dressing, oils, those stored in plastic will absorb that plastic packaging and those chemicals far more readily than more neutral foods. And glass jars are widely available and quite affordable. Number 3, reduce the use of plastic. And when we do use it, check the plastic code. So for plastic containers, look for the codes 1, 2, 4, and 5, and avoid 3, 6, and 7. Number 4, reduce canned food consumption when possible. The epoxy linings of most food cans contain bisphenol compounds. Choosing fresh, frozen, or glass-jarred alternatives, especially for high-acid foods like tomatoes, makes a meaningful difference. Number 5, ditch the microwave popcorn bags. PFAS coatings on microwave popcorn bags are among the highest measured sources of PFAS exposures in the American diet. So we can pop them loose in the glass bowl, simpler, cheaper, and chemical-free. And number 6, filter water and store it in glass or stainless steel. PFAS contamination of drinking water is now documented in thousands of communities across the U.S., and an activated carbon filter significantly reduces PFAS levels. And slide, please. And four quick takeaways. Number one, PFAS, bisphenols, and phthalates are not hypothetical concerns. They are measurable contaminants detected in the bodies of the overwhelming majority of people tested, and their migration from packaging into food is documented across hundreds of peer reviewed scientific studies. Number two, children face disproportionate risk. The science on this is consistent and sobering. Exposure during critical developmental windows produces effects on brain development, reproductive health, hormonal system, immune system, neurodevelopment that persist across a lifetime. Number three, safer alternatives exist and are available now. Glass, stainless steel, and 1245 plastics offer real world options that dramatically reduce chemical exposures, and these are mainstream, affordable, and increasingly accessible. And finally, while regulation continues to evolve, the EPA now has enforceable limits on PFAS in drinking water, and regulation alone won't solve this problem quickly, but consumer knowledge and choice are powerful forces that drive both market change and policy change. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Rainbow. We really appreciate all of that. Just deep dive into the science. Thank you so much. And yeah, I want to just note that, ultimately what we really need, right, is for food manufacturers and packaging companies to make their products safer, or for governments to, step in and pass laws that require everything at the grocery store to be safe. But in the meantime, there are things that we can be doing to protect ourselves at home, and that will, drive that market shift. So I appreciate you noting that, because that's what we're going to get into next. Next, I want to introduce Kevin Loria, who again is the Senior Health and Food Reporter with Consumer Reports. He covers topics ranging from healthy living to environmental health and contaminants in the world around us. He has, for more than a decade, written about science and health. Before joining Consumer Reports in 2018, he covered science, health, and the environment for Business Insider. Kevin holds a Master of Arts from the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism, the City University of New York, and a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Notre Dame. So he's going to go over some research that Consumer Reports did to highlight the prevalence of these chemicals in food packaging, and then go through some tips for all of us on how to avoid exposure. So I'll hand it over to you, Kevin.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen. Um, yes, I am a reporter at Consumer Reports. I have been covering environmental health and topics related to this throughout my time at CR. Ever since I started there, my editor and I agreed that we talk about products a lot at Consumer Reports. And while there are good reasons to do so, it's also important to look at how the chemicals in these various products could potentially expose people to health risks. And so we can talk about these things. Plus, Consumer Reports does have a long history of looking at kind of toxic contaminants in food, including bisphenols, and more recently, other chemicals in plastic as well. And so in my time at CR, I've written about PFAS in food packaging, chemicals in plastic, and microplastics in food and around us. So we can go to the next slide. In recent years, we at CR and many others have spent a lot of time talking about the harms of some of the chemicals in plastic and why these things shouldn't be in our food. And these are many of the things that Rainbow talked about: PFAS, phthalates, bisphenols, and we've talked as well about microplastics, but they're a little bit harder to study. We can get into that a little bit later on. Recently, in 2024, in order to get a better understanding of the current state of the issue, our scientists at CR did an analysis of a lot of supermarket staple foods and fast food products, things that are packaged. And the idea was to look at the levels of some of these chemicals, specifically bisphenols and phthalates. And these are chemicals that we have looked at in food over the years. They are important to address because, as we just heard, they can be harmful to human health. We have a lot of documented research that shows there are health issues associated with these chemicals, and we know that they are widely used in packaging and that they can migrate from that packaging into food. So for this recent study that we did, our team selected 85 different foods to kind of get a broad look at many of the different foods that are out there to see what the levels of these chemicals might be. We looked at prepared meals, fruits and vegetables, meat and dairy, baby food, fast food, meat and seafood. The only requirement was that everything that we tested was packaged in some sort of way. So some of these were canned foods, others came in pouches, foil, plastic wraps of various sorts, or other material. And we wanted to focus on these packaged foods because the chemicals that we're looking for in food most likely come from packaging, and that could happen anywhere in the food production process. We know that highly processed foods are often kind of in different parts of different types of packaging as they're being made. But we looked at the foods that come in packaging when you purchase them at the store. So we selected 2 to 3 samples of each food that we were looking at to make sure we kind of had a accurate range and we weren't kind of getting some random outlier, and took a look at the levels of these bisphenols and phthalates. So we can go to the next slide. The scientists that we had who did the testing, they were most concerned with the phthalate findings. We found phthalates in every food that we tested except for one type of seltzer water. So again, these are chemicals that are used to make plastics flexible. We know that some of them are linked to a number of different health issues. And of course, with anything like this, we know that these chemicals are everywhere. They're all around us. The question is, how high are the levels and are they at a dangerous level? And I will say that none of the foods that we tested exceeded current legal thresholds on phthalates in food in the US or the EU. However, and I know that I'm sure that Rainbow could talk about this more, our experts say that the levels used for those thresholds are not really as health protective as they should be. Um, we know that some of these phthalates, DEHP, to give an example, it's one of the better studied phthalates. And at levels kind of that are below these thresholds, we have seen that DEHP is linked to health concerns, including insulin resistance, high blood pressure, reproductive issues, early menopause, and more. And more than half of the foods we tested had DEHP levels above the thresholds that studies have found to be linked to health problems. And so, definitely a concerning finding. When it comes to phthalates, the unfortunate part of our finding, and the part that makes it kind of hard for us to avoid on a consumer level, is that the levels did not depend on packaging type, and no one particular type of food, like dairy products or prepared meals, was more likely than another to have phthalates at higher or lower levels. The highest levels that we found were in a ravioli product, but we also found higher levels in protein shake, canned peaches, a number of different fast food items, and a can of salmon. Um, when it comes to the other chemicals that we looked at, bisphenols, which are usually added to plastics to make them harder, think of like a hard plastic water bottle, our findings were, if not fully reassuring, still somewhat more reassuring. We've looked at bisphenols over the years, including in 2009, and we did still detect them in 79% of the samples that we looked at, but at levels that were lower than they had been in 2009, indicating perhaps that, raising people, people have raised their voices about BPA a lot. And while there has been some substitution to other bisphenols like BPS, that, perhaps those concerns have moved things in the right direction. Hopefully so, or and that's kind of the hope, is that kind of continuing to raise people's voices, raise consumer voices, and to call for regulation on this and make an impact. So before we move on, I just want to say, I understand microplastics are another thing that a lot of people are interested in and curious about. Well, what about those? Do we know what the levels of these are in food? And I will say that we didn't look at microplastics for this most recent study, just because it's very hard to measure the very small microplastics, especially the nanoplastics, that get down to kind of very tiny levels in food. And, having a good way to study those is really essential before we say kind of what these levels are. And when it comes to talking about the harms of microplastics in the first place, we do have a growing body of evidence that links microplastics to a number of different harms. That said, we still know less about them than we do these chemicals like phthalates and bisphenols. And so, for this particular study, we focused on those chemicals that are in plastic, things that microplastics might carry into you in the first place. And in the future, we hope to look at microplastics more. So we can move on to the next slide. Think that the other thing that's important to talk about here is kind of what we can do to avoid these chemicals and to kind of limit our exposure to them. And Rainbow talked about a lot of these things, Dr. Rubin, in a really fantastic way. So I'll try to keep it short, but just to kind of talk about some of these things again. I think on the first level, it is important to recognize there's only so much that we can do as individuals, which is why state action and regulation on this is so important. But that said, there are things that you can do to limit your exposures to these chemicals from food packaging, especially in the meantime. So the first thing is, it might seem fairly obvious, but simply avoiding packaging can be helpful. Since so many of these chemicals, along with things like PFAS and microplastics, do come from packaging, doing what you can to kind of limit your exposure to packaging can reduce that exposure. Fast foods and highly processed foods are more likely to be packaged and more likely to spend time in packaging. So, reducing your intake of these can help. There is research that indicates that people who eat more highly processed foods do have higher levels of phthalates in their bodies. And so, trying to eat fresh, minimally processed food is beneficial, for these reasons, along with other health reasons. When we talk about food storage, and this is something that we just talked about as well, it's helpful to try to avoid storing foods in plastic containers. Try to use things that are glass or stainless steel instead. And yes, you don't want to heat food in plastic containers as well, since that does encourage the leaching of these chemicals from the containers to the food, something that is especially the case with higher fat or more highly acidic foods. When we're looking at what's in our kitchen, we can also kind of look at the tools that we're using. Chopping something up on a plastic cutting board can create microplastics. So trying to use a wood or silicone alternative can help. That said, it doesn't mean that you have to automatically kind of go out and replace everything that you have right away. You can kind of think about the uses that are most risky, like maybe try to avoid pouring hot food into a plastic bowl or using plastic wrap to cover it up. But if you've got you're washing some salad in a salad spinner, that's much less time and much less exposure and heat, and so less likely to expose you to those chemicals in that time. Um, Beyond what you can do in the kitchen, you can also do a lot in your home to reduce your exposure to these chemicals. And we can move to the next slide, please. Um, One of the things that we can do is just kind of look at the ways these chemicals are all around us. So we just did talk about how these phthalates like DEHP are in many products that have fragrances, things like soaps, cosmetics, and cleaners. Um, when we look at other things in our homes, clothing and textiles, if these are made from synthetic fabrics instead of natural fibers, these are often sources of microplastics and potentially various chemicals from plastics. So trying to stick to natural fibers like wool or cotton as much as possible can help minimize exposure. Avoiding vinyl is another thing that we can do to limit our exposure to phthalates. And then finally, these last couple points that I want to talk about are simply they're related and they have to do with dust because I'm sure as everyone knows, no matter what you do, it's kind of impossible to avoid dust collecting on things. It just kind of appears out of nowhere. But kind of taking the steps that you can to wipe that away, to clean that up can be really helpful because dust basically acts as a sink for chemicals and plastics. So, if you do an analysis of household dust, you'll find bisphenols, phthalates. You'll also find flame retardants. Dust that collects from outdoors can also have heavy metals and things like that in it. So, being conscious of this and kind of doing what you can to try to combat that kind of never-ending growth of dust can be really helpful. And so that might be using ventilation where it's helpful and appropriate. It can be vacuuming and especially vacuuming with a HEPA filter so that you're not just kind of blasting it up into the air everywhere, but kind of being aware of dust and kind of the fact that it can be full of these things can help, especially if you have little ones crawling around on the floor who are exposed to a lot more dust than the rest of us who are kind of further away from this. And so these are some of the steps that you can take. And I do think that, some of these things can help reduce your exposure significantly. But that said, it's the sort of thing where systematic problems kind of need these systematic solutions and they need the kind of regulation that we can have as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kevin. That was great. I am definitely more motivated to clean the dust in my home now coming out of that. Thank you. Okay, so yes, it's great to have tips on what we can do at home, but as we've all referenced, even better if we get governments to take action so that if you go to the grocery store, you can ensure that everything is safe. So I'm going to now talk a little bit about what has been done and then what we're pushing for here in California this year. So the first thing I want to note is that some action on these chemicals is already happening, both in California and across the country. So PFAS has been prohibited from paper food packaging, both in California and now nationwide, though still remain in plastic packaging, as we've referenced. In California, PFAS has also been banned from cosmetics, clothing, and children's products. California has banned phthalates from IV bags and tubing, from cosmetics, and from toys and children's products. And then BPA was banned from baby bottles, I think about a decade ago. And then the legislature recently expanded that to include all bisphenols in bottles, pacifiers, and teething products. So clearly, we're making some progress, and it shows that there are alternatives to these chemicals if, companies can come up with a way to make these products without the chemicals. But they're still in our food packaging. So it also just emphasizes the need to take action there. And so that's what we're working to do in California this year. So the California legislature is considering Assembly Bill 1148, the Safer Food Packaging Act. This will ban phthalates and bisphenols from food packaging. It doesn't take on PFAS. We need to do that too, but I think it will make take a huge step in the right direction in terms of making our food safer by making our packaging safer. This bill's already passed the state assembly, which is great, but it now needs to pass the state senate and to do so this summer. So CalPIRG is working with partners at Breast Cancer Prevention Partners and EWG to make sure that this bill gets through. So if you have not signed our petition and support yet, I'll throw that in the chat momentarily. It'd be great to get your support by letting your state senator know to vote yes for this. I also want to note that CalPIRG is going to be spending time this summer working to build support for this bill. So if you are on this webinar because you're part of our campaign team, either right now or going to be this summer, I just want to say thank you so much for helping us, and I look forward to working with you on that project this summer. Okay, so that is basically what we have to go through, and I learned a lot, and hopefully you learned a lot too, but I'm sure you still have some questions. So I want to make sure that we have a moment to open it up to questions for everybody. So I'm going to stop sharing my slide. I am now going to put that petition I mentioned into the chat so people have that, and then we will look at the questions that we have in the Q&A. So again, you can use either the chat or the Q&A feature, whichever you can find first is fine, to throw your questions in there, and we will open up to our experts. Okay. So we've already got two people asking basically the same question, and I don't know if Rainbow, you know this, but two folks have mentioned that PVC piping is what's being used in their plumbing, which then can impact their water, which can then get onto their food. And so there was a question if you know of any alternatives to PVC in plumbing that is a recommendation. Now, this is not to do with food packaging, so it might be outside of your purview, but figured I'd see if either of you know anything about that.
Yeah, I don't know too much other than that PVC piping is very widespread. Copper piping is obviously preferable, but there's a huge cost differential, and PVC is quite standard, so very difficult to avoid. But again, you can filter your water, and you can even install like household level water filters so that your shower water can get filtered as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then next, there was another question related for somebody who is, tries to avoid the water quality that they have, and so they fill up big jugs of water, and was curious if there's alternatives like glass or stainless steel.
Yeah, I know that there are like glass carboys. Like you can get the plastic and then put the water in the glass, so that's an option. And I know that there are some stainless steel water filters. I think it's called Berkey. Are either of you familiar with those? I'm pretty sure. But even an activated carbon filter does quite a lot. So there are really options all along the spectrum. Mm-hmm. Kevin, anything to add?
Uh, No, I mean, I think that those sound great. I think that in addition, the activated carbon filters are great. We've also, I think, seen that the reverse osmosis filters, if you have one built into your system, can be really good for PFAS as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. And then someone else is now following up with a question about not cooking with sink water, such as soup, tea, etc. Like if boiling gets the chemicals out.
Mm. I think it varies by chemical, and I don't want to say anything incorrect, so I'm not sure, but I can look it up and send it to Jen, and maybe she can send it out to
Yeah,
the group.
can definitely do that. I mean, I'd say if, if worried, you can get your water tested, right? And then you can filter. Um, but we can look into the boiling by chemical. Okay, I'm gonna move on to away from water. Someone is asking, okay, so I was using plastic bread bags to buy bulk foods. They were really handy because they're clear, but I switched to cloth because I was concerned about the friction with the plastic bags. Is that a valid concern? So switching to a cloth bag for going, bulk food is a good way to avoid packaging, of course.
Yeah, especially if it's being stored in plastic. But the alternative too is like if you bring the plastic bag home with the goods and then just transfer them to a glass container, then you're minimizing that storage time. So remember, like, it's the time, it's the heat, and it's the food content, like the fat content or the acid content. So if it's just going between the grocery store and home, that's pretty minimal. Um, and that's just one, you can use it for convenience and then transfer it.
Okay, great. Okay, here's a question which I actually have a recommendation on this, but see what you both think. Someone who uses glass containers but with plastic food lids, which I think is pretty common. Like I have, the Pyrex um, glass storage, but it has a plastic lid. If the food does not contact with the plastic lid, are they safe? Which was going to be my recommendation is like never fill it all the way to the top so that the food's not touching the lid, but as long as it's below, I think that's the best method unless, you can always try to purchase a different type of lid would be, of course, the other way to do it. But any other recommendations on that, avoiding touching the plastic food lids?
Yeah, I would agree with that recommendation. And then also, if it doesn't touch the plastic, it means that you can kind of just like rinse or easily wash off the top as opposed to putting it in the dishwasher, because exposing that lid to the hot water in the dishwasher then coats all of our dishes. So that's another helpful tactic is just to keep those lids out of the dishwasher.
That's great. I'm taking that one too. I think I need to be better about that. Um, okay, so there's a question about the netting bags for fruits and vegetables, which tend to be
Mm.
plastic netting, if anyone knows what type of plastic that is, if that's a plastic to be concerned with.
I'm not sure what that netting is. I know what you're talking about though. Um, but again, if it's just the transfer, and you avoid storing it in those bags, then that's a benefit.
Okay, great. Okay, so sorry, there's lots of questions. I think I mean, you've both kind of mentioned this, but I don't know if you have any specific stats. There's a question about, there's research that has been done about the rate of leakage from, say, a plastic water bottle. If the water is in there for an hour versus a week, does it matter? I mean, I think the answer is yes, but anything else to say about that?
Yeah, the time matters and the heat matters. So a lot of times, plastic water bottles might be stored in the back of the car or something, and that's a place where it means that plastic chemicals will be leaching into the water. So think about both of those aspects, both time and heat.
Great. Um, well, maybe this is a good question for you, Kevin, because I think you've all done some research on storage containers. So there's a question about just recommendations for different vessels to use for microwave cooking, like if there's the best ones.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to microwave cooking, I mean, we have, I would need to check to see kind of if our kitchen team has done more. I would say that kind of from the health and food side, we would just kind of continue to give that recommendation to not microwave anything in plastic, and that, even most things that say to microwave them in their packaging can be transferred into a glass bowl for the microwave instead. And that would be what we would recommend.
Great. Um, they just keep coming. There is a question about canned fish. Is canned fish or any kind of, sorry, I'm trying to read this. Trying to interpret the language used here, but I think they're just asking if there's any safe alternatives for canned fish, same for beer or water. So just are there safer can alternatives?
Hmm. Let's see. Kevin, do you have any?
Well, I mean, I think that aside from looking at kind of glass jarred options, I don't know about kind of safer cans specifically in general. I think that one thing that when we talk about these things that, our experts have said multiple times is that, when we're talking about something that's a nutritious food in the first place, which, canned fish can be part of a nutritious diet, many other things can be, part of a nutritious diet. We don't want to avoid those healthy things entirely. That a lot of these things are important, and that feeding ourselves and our families is really important. And so we do want better products, and we want manufacturers to do better at keeping these things out of our products, but we can't not eat the healthy things that we have access to. And so I would say to that we want to make sure to kind of balance that recommendation.
Hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. I'm more familiar with the recommendation just to stick to smaller fish, like anchovies and sardines are highly potent, very nutritious fish, and they have, because they're at the lower end of the food chain and they're less fatty and smaller fish, they accumulate fewer food toxins than some of the bigger fish, but less having to do with the packaging.
Okay, great. Okay, so we are coming up on time, and I want to make sure to get people some resources. So there was at least one question about the Consumer Reports study. Um, and so I'm just going to throw it in the chat for everyone. So someone asked about what was that seltzer water that you found? I don't know if you know that off the top of your head, but you can read the study there.
Yes, I think it was polar, but
Great. And then I'm going to throw the petition for 1148 in the chat again because some folks were asking for that. And then CalPERC also put together a guide on safer food packaging. Oh, I think that's what I just threw in the chat. So now I need to throw in the petition again. Okay. And we will send an email. So there were some questions about getting access to some of the slides and the webinar. So we have recorded this webinar. We're going to be putting that up on YouTube probably by tomorrow, and we'll send that out to folks. I can also send, all the things I just threw in the chat, these resources out to everybody as well. And then we've got a couple questions that are on our list to figure out for people. If you've got additional questions, you can feel free to reach out to me. I will throw my email in the chat as well because we aren't going to have time to get to everybody's questions. So I want to just make sure there are resources there for you. Maybe we have time for one or two more. Um, let's see. Plastic used in breakfast cereal boxes. Concerned. Lots of very specific types of plastic questions. I don't know what number that is, so I think you might have to look at. I think it probably doesn't have a number because it's the inside.
Yeah, I'm not sure what number that is, but maybe Google knows.
Yeah. Yeah,
But the
yeah.
key thing is to
yeah.
remember your one, two, and four, five. Remember what you're looking for.
Great. And then there's some things that are kind of getting away from food packaging into other PFAS issues. So like frying pans. So yes, there are non-stick frying pans that have PFAS on them. There are lots of alternatives though. I'm sure that there's resources on the Consumer Reports website that you could easily Google to find some, good alternatives to better pans. So maybe I'll just end with that if you've got questions, I bet that if you go to any of these groups' websites, you can find some additional tips there. Um, but if you are struggling, I threw my email in the chat for people as well. And we'll wrap it up there. Thank you all so much for joining, and thank you Kevin and Dr. Rubin, for being here to lend your expertise. We really appreciate your support.
Thank you so much.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thanks, everybody.